Hey, good morning, everyone from Durant, Oklahoma, and I think probably Miami, Florida. We'll find out from AJ in just a moment where he's coming from. Welcome to this live stream about quick wins in cloud compliance. We're going to be talking specifically today about AWS. My name is Clay Risenhoover. I'm a principal instructor for the SANS Institute, and I'm the author of a couple of classes for SANS as well. I've got the AUD507 class and the relatively new SEC557 class, which is all about enterprise compliance, and that includes in the cloud. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So thank you. I see a few of you are saying hello right now and letting us know where you are. I appreciate you doing that. In fact, I'm going to ask you to do something else while AJ and I are introducing ourselves. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and give me a feel for why you're attending a live stream like this and what is it that you do in your day job. Are you more of a compliance person? Are you an auditor? Are you an engineer who's interested in how to do things the right way? I really would like to find out who it is that we have with us in the stream today. Well, as I mentioned, my name is Clay. I'm a certified public accountant. So for those of you outside the US, that's kind of like a chartered accountant. I've got a number of technical certifications as well. And I'm just kind of an IT guy from way back. In fact, I was thinking this morning, I installed my first network for money back in 1987. It was 2 Macintosh computers and a laser writer using phone cable and 230 kilobit networks. And things have changed a lot since I started in IT. You know, we hadn't heard of things like virtualization even at that point, certainly not things like cloud computing. And so over the years, I've had to kind of adapt to how do we do things now? And what do I do if I can't go lay my hands physically on that machine that I'm interested in? We're going to talk about how we solve some of those problems today. So AJ, why don't you take a minute and let everybody know who you are as well?
Absolutely. Thanks, Clay. And welcome, everyone. It's super cool to see that we have representation from all over the globe here attending. This is pretty awesome. My name is AJ Yawn. I am the founder and CEO of BiteCheck, a cybersecurity compliance SaaS company. We help automate SOC 2, ISO, and HIPAA compliance. I'm also an associate instructor here at the SANS Institute. I help teach SEC557 there with Clay, where we talk about compliance at the enterprise level and the cloud level. I've been in the cybersecurity industry not quite as long as Clay, just for the past decade. Started in the Army as an Army officer, ended up earning the rank of captain and did some cool stuff there. And then went out and really carved my background in compliance in the cloud. I spent a ton of time working with AWS and helping companies that are hosted in AWS comply. And it's become sort of an addiction to me, AWS and AWS security. So I'm extremely excited about this because compliance can be difficult in the cloud. It can be tough to know where to start. And hopefully after this session, you all have a good understanding from Clay and I of where you should spend some of your energy.
Awesome. Thank you, AJ. So let's kind of start about talking about this idea of compliance itself. You know, I'm a CISA, I'm a CISM, so I kind of lean on ISACA sometimes for definitions. And I have to say they did a really good job with this one. The ISACA definition of compliance is what I've got up on the screen for you here. In fact, we'll drop a link to this ISACA glossary if any of you want to use this in your day jobs. The idea with compliance is the ability to demonstrate adherence to whatever our requirements are, whether that's contractual, whether it's regulatory or legal, or it's just our own internal policies and procedures. We want to be able to demonstrate that we're doing the things that we ought to be doing. So to be a compliance professional, I have to both understand what the organization is supposed to be doing and then figure out a way to measure whether that's really happening or not. And so what we want to do today is talk to you about some really basic compliance issues that you should be facing in your organization. And we want to try to give you some of the skills that you would need to be able to measure those things that we're interested in. And our thought was this: whether you're brand new to the cloud or you've been operating there for years, whether you're new to compliance or you've been doing compliance for quite some time, you still just want to know, are we handling things the way that we need to be handling them? And in fact, this is something I think AJ would agree with me with. We see this a lot as we talk to students. One of the first questions is just, where do I start? This is such a big problem. Where do I start and how do I deal with this? And you've probably, a lot of you heard the analogy, well, it's like eating an elephant. You should just do it one bite at a time. But even at that, an elephant's pretty big. Where do I take that first bite? And I think that's really what we want to talk about today is where do we take those very first bites to make sure that we're doing the very basic things that we need to be doing in order to prove compliance in our organizations. So that's really the goal today. Can we demonstrate that we're adhering to laws or regulations or just whatever our own internal policies are? So to start with this, we've got a couple of resources that we'd like to give you. And AJ, I'm going to let you talk about the first couple of these.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Clay. And just like Clay was mentioning, one of the hardest things I hear is, where do I start? How do I get moving? There's so many security services on AWS. There's so much to do to protect myself. And it gets a lot easier when you have a framework, when you know that what your defined desired end state is, that you can benchmark your organization again, and then you have several phases to work with to measure your deliverables and improve and iterate over time. And the framework that we're going to talk about is the AWS Security Maturity Model, which we'll drop a link to it here in the comments so that you all can explore this. And this model is a set of guidance and documentation from AWS that's intended to help organizations assess their security maturity, shape their strategy, and prioritize. That's a key word here. Prioritize the future work accordingly. So Clay and I are going to spend a ton of time today talking about those quick wins. But once you get through those, there are some more things to do. It doesn't stop there. And this model helps you kind of have that roadmap of moving through here. One of the notes here that you should kind of know is that AWS obviously wants you to use their security services. So they're going to point you to an extensive use of their security services to achieve what they consider to be a strong security posture. It's going to cross-reference numerous other sources like the well-architected framework, the security pillar, security documentation, and white papers that we'll share with you throughout this. And like I said, we're going to start with the quick wins. Clay and I are also going to show you some open source tools or talk about some open source tools that you can do some of this stuff with. But this is a great model if you're hosted in AWS to go through and figure out what are the things I should be doing. One of the things initially that we should talk about here, as you see on the left side of this screen here of the model, are these categories. And those are cloud adoption framework categories that are pulled directly from AWS's cloud adoption framework. They cover critical security principles that AWS considers foundational for companies building in the cloud. And we are going to drop a link to the Cloud Adoption Framework PDF here in the chat. And Clay just pulled up on the screen the security perspective. And if you're looking at these, you're probably like, this doesn't seem really AWS specific. These are security governance, incident response, application security, vulnerability management. These are things we should be thinking about from a security perspective, regardless of where you're hosted, which is great because even though we're talking about AWS, you can apply a lot of these principles and things you should be caring about from this cloud adoption framework to wherever you're hosted. And the whole goal of this, as it says there on the screen, is designed to help us achieve the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our data and cloud workloads. If you're a CISO, if you're an internal audit leader, a security architect or engineer, or a chief compliance officer, these categories are going to be critical for you as you're kind of going through the security maturity model, as you're building your security program to reference. Are we doing the right things for security governance? Are we doing the right things for infrastructure protection? And we're going to talk about a few of these areas today as we go through this webcast. So now that, we want to spend a little bit of time up front just to introduce the security maturity model, to introduce the cloud adoption framework. And now that we have a solid understanding and you all have some of those links, let's start focusing on some of these low-hanging compliance items. And Clay and I both feel the same way, that you really can only start with inventory and tagging. You got to know what you have. You can't protect something that you don't know what you have. And especially in the cloud, without tags, it can be really difficult to have comfort over your inventory of assets. I was actually just talking with my CTO the other day about how important tagging is and how many people get it wrong in the cloud. And the reason in the cloud it's so important is because everything's a resource. the roles, the users, all of the actual compute resources, your storage stuff. Every single thing is a resource that you should know what's going on. And when tagging's done right, it saves your security team a whole lot of time. Imagine you have some automation and compliance rules set up to check for some key compliance configurations, but you don't necessarily want to respond to everything that happens in a dev environment or with dev resources. If you have tags set up on those things, that Clay will do some demos here in a little bit, you can have more of a structured approach to chasing down alerts and going after things, because you know what are the more sensitive things. Tagging on AWS is actually fairly simple, but unfortunately not that common when I see these environments. And it just makes it so much easier to visually or programmatically identify resources and make them really descriptive, so you understand what's the purpose of tagging, what are they doing. If you know what a resource is supposed to be doing, you're in much better position to quickly assess and, if necessary, adjust things. This helps with cost management as well. This helps with security. So many benefits of tagging. And I'm going to let Clay go ahead and start to show you some really cool ways you can do tagging in the console here with the tag editor. You're also going to see us drop a link in the comments of this cool open source tool called Graffiti Monkey, which will help you solve tagging at scale. So if you want to go back and you're probably listening to this and you're like, man, I have thousands of instances. There's no way I can go and tag all of those. This Graffiti Monkey tool was made for you. It goes out and tags all your instances. Then it's going to retroactively tag all the EBS volumes and all your EBS snapshots associated with them, which is definitely something I would add to your toolkit. But Clay, I'm going to turn it over to you to show the tag editor and get into some of the details there on tagging.
Cool. Thank you, AJ. So let me answer a question that we had in the chat earlier, and that is there any part of this that's going to be cloud agnostic? And the short answer to that, Craig, is no, but. So we're not going to be cloud agnostic, but we're going to do 3 of these. So today is AWS. On September 20th, we're going to be doing another one talking about Azure. And then sometime after that, and I'm sorry, I don't have the date in front of me, we'll be doing a 3rd part about Google Cloud. And as we can do this, we're also going to try to show you some tools that might be a better multi-cloud solution. If you need to take measurements in multiple places, then we'll definitely try to talk to you about how to do that as well. Now, I would say that this security maturity model, if you would scribble out all of the AWS product names, is still a pretty good model for us to use in a lot of places. And so using the CAF categories that AJ highlighted for you just a minute ago, a lot of these would work pretty well no matter who the provider is that you're dealing with. So I've got to just kind of second what AJ said there. One of the big problems that I often see is organizations not knowing what their inventory really looks like. And if you've used resources from organizations like the Center for Internet Security, maybe you've looked at the critical security controls, you know control number 1 is that you need to get your arms around your inventory. You need to understand what resources you have and whether they're authorized or not. And that actually is one of the big problems that we often run into. And I've seen it happen a few different ways. I've got an auditor buddy who calls this the developer credit card problem. We've got a developer with a credit card. We've got some new product that we're thinking about standing up. And so the developer goes out, maybe they build their own AWS account. They build their stack for their application in that account. And it's only ever intended to be used for testing, but we finally get everything together and make it work. And so it's easier to just bring that into production. Have we really been able to find those resources that maybe got created in ways that we weren't really expecting? So I'm a real heavy command line user, but there are times that it just makes sense for us to do things in the web console. And this is probably one of those times. If you are just trying to get a handle on what inventory your organization has, the tag editor in AWS is kind of my secret weapon for doing that initial inventory of all of the resources are out there. So I've gone into the AWS resource groups section of the AWS console here, and I'm going to click on the tag editor. Now, a couple of things that we'll talk about here. The tag editor is just what it sounds like. It's really intended for us to be able to add these inventory tags or other control tags to our resources. But it's also the one place that I have found inside the AWS console that's aware of all of the taggable resources in the environment. So if you need to gather that first inventory and you want to see if you're even using tagging yet, the tag editor can be a really good place for you to go. Now, here on my screen, I've got a couple of defaults here. I'm set up to work in the US East 1 region right now. But you may want, when you're doing your initial inventory, to either choose all regions or to choose the regions that you're likely to be using in your organization. In fact, as I was working on this demo for this class, I guess I'll show you some of my own bad control best practices here. As I was working on this demo for this live stream, I had a little trouble in US East 1. One day, one of the API endpoints that I needed wasn't available when I was using Terraform to stand up the environment that we were going to be using for the stream. And so I thought, you know what, I'll just do it in US East 2. So in my Terraform file, I changed it over to US East 2. I was able to create the stuff I needed. And I went on. And then later on, I was coming back looking for my stuff and I couldn't find it all. Well, it's because I had it now running in 2 different regions. So if you think that there's a chance that you may be running in multiple regions, it would probably make sense for you to go ahead and select those regions before you ask the tag editor to find everything. Now, what I'm going to do is say, hey, just show me all supported resource types. If it's capable of being tagged, I want to see it here. Once I've done that, I've chosen the regions that make sense and I have chosen the resource types that I care about. I'm going to click on search resources here. Now, this is going to take some time to run. So kind of like those cooking shows, I've already got the turkey in the oven here. I've already downloaded the resources from this so that we don't have to wait on it. But after a couple of minutes, I could come back and I would see all of the resources that were downloaded by the resource, by the tag editor here. So this is the CSV that I pulled up, and I'll go ahead now and enlarge it for you so that you can see a little bit better. It looks like I've got about 75 different taggable resources in my account right now. That's quite small. This is a small environment that we set up just to use for doing demos today. But you can already see that there are a number of tags that we have tried to use somewhere in the environment, like business unit or classification or the project ID or project name, that it doesn't look like my engineers have really applied here. So if I scroll down, I can see there are a few. I've got a couple of EC2 instances that they seem to have applied all of these tags to, but I've got a lot of other things like subnets and virtual private clouds or VPCs that don't seem to be tagged here. So it's interesting that I've got that tagging information, but it's also really nice because I just probably got the most complete inventory that I'm ever going to get. I'm an auditor, you know, as part of the work that we do before the entrance conference, before the field work, we always ask for inventories and we always assume that they're wrong. This may be one of the few times that I would actually believe an inventory when you brought it to me if you used a technology like this to be able to get that for me. Now, let's see. We've got a couple of other links that we're going to give you here. So AWS has written a pretty good thing on tagging best practices. So we've got a link for you on that. And this is well, and then they've done a tagging overview as well. So I'm actually going to give you 2 links here. I'm going to warn you about that tagging best practices. It's archived. It's an older document, but it's still got some good things to say. So what we did is we went out and found the old archived AWS document, and we gave you a copy of that. But I'm a compliance guy and I like to automate things. So just working through the console using something like this is not really going to be the way that I would like to make everything work. So instead, what I'm going to do is show you out at the command line, how could we gather similar information? Now you can see here, I'm configured to use that US East 1 region. And in this particular demo, that's the only region that we're working in. So that's going to make it a little bit easier for me to do some of the queries that I would like to do here. Now, I'm going to mix and match a couple of different ways of working at the command line today. We've got the AWS CLI, which is what a lot of you are used to. It's the kind of de facto way of gathering information from AWS. And when I run commands in it, I'm going to get back JSON formatted data. So for instance, if I were interested in the EC2 instances that I have running, or the virtual machines that are in this environment, I could run AWS EC2 describe instances, and that's going to show me in JSON format all of the instances that I've got out there. Now I can see here that I've got a JSON array called reservations. I've got another array under that called instances, and that's going to be where the actual data is about the instances that I have running out there, including, let's see if we can find it quickly here, any tags that are associated with that particular instance. So this is really what I'm interested in here. Now, this is where to measure compliance, I need to have some sort of a rule to measure against. We always say in audit that we're testing an assertion. Management needs to tell us that you're doing something here. So in this case, let's say that management has said, you know, we're going to tag all of our resources, at least with a business unit, just so that we know who that business, what business unit that particular resource belongs to. That gives me something that I could check then. Do we have a business unit tag associated with these taggable objects out there in the organization? Now, I don't really like working directly with JSON, but we certainly could do it. If I wanted to pull that JSON data out, and let's look at just the instances that we have here in our EC2 environment, I could use a tool like JQ to do this. Hey, show me that reservations array, and inside it, show me the first element of the instances array. In fact, let's just pipe that through more. And we're going to get back, again, similar JSON data. We could go through, find the tags for all of our instances. But this is where, as an auditor, I like to speed things up as much as I can. I will often use the equivalent PowerShell commands to gather this data, because PowerShell is going to take that JSON, parse it out into an object that I can query really easily. And with a very short command, I can gather information from the environment. Now, we're going to do a lot of demos like this with a lot of commands. And so we dropped a link at the very beginning of the day. And Stephen, if you will, let's go ahead and do that again. We've got a page that we stood up on the SEC557 website that's nothing but all of the links for today and all of the commands that I'm going to run during the demo. So you don't have to try to scribble down the PowerShell commands as I'm doing them. We've given you a list of all of the commands that I'm going to run today. So if I were wanted to do this in PowerShell, let's just kind of clear the screen out here. I could use get EC2 instance. That's going to be the equivalent of the EC2 describe instances under the AWS CLI. And what I'm going to do is say to PowerShell, hey, let's just go through each of those instances, looking at their tags, trying to find the name tag. So what did we name the object? And then is there a business unit tag associated with that? And that will give me a list of the 3 instances that I've got running in this environment. If they have a business unit tag associated with them, then it'll show me that as well. But I can see I've got a little problem right here. This very first one, well, it has a name, but it doesn't seem to have a business unit tag associated with it. So I would mark that one as being non-compliant, and that would be something that we would definitely want to pay attention to. Now, it doesn't have to be done like this. I could do a query where I say, hey, you know, just show me the instances that don't have a business unit tag. I don't really care about the ones that are compliant. I care more about the ones that are not. And if I were to do that, then I would just say, sorry, that's the same command. Show me those instances where my business unit tag has a count of less than 1. If I've got any that have 0 business unit tags, then those are going to be non-compliant. that's really the instance that I'm interested in. So now I see what IP addresses have been associated with it, which subnet it's on, and I've got that instance ID that I can use to track this one down. And of course, it wouldn't just have to be things like EC2 instances that we were tracking down here. Let's say that I care about the subnets that we've set up in our virtual private cloud environment. With PowerShell, I could do get EC2 subnet, give me a list of all of those subnets, and again, show me those that have a business unit tag with a count of less than 1. And then I'm going to pull out just the fields that I would care about. Now, in this case, I'm seeing a lot of them, and I'm sorry, I'm going to talk to you like an auditor for just a minute here because I see something kind of interesting here. I've got a bunch of subnets that all seem to be in the same VPC that are not tagged correctly. And then I've got this one right here that, well, they got a name on it, but not a business unit. And then a bunch more that just look like they were done incorrectly. Something that we will commonly see on AWS is that we've got a default networking environment that gets created when we create the AWS account. There's going to be a default VPC or virtual private cloud. That VPC will contain a number of pre-built subnets. Then we use some kind of infrastructure as code tool like Terraform to generate our real infrastructure, and we never go back and do anything about that default VPC or those default subnets. So a lot of times when I see this, it tells me, hey, we've got a whole default environment out there that we're not using, and it's probably never actually been configured correctly. Okay, so that's some of how I would take measurements when I'm looking at things like inventory. I'm going to go ahead and toss it back to AJ for a little while to talk about some other options that we have for gathering inventory, some other tools that are specific to AWS to help us out with this.
Yeah, thanks, Clay. And it's always if anybody ever takes SEC557, we're gonna spend a lot of time in demos going through and learning how to use PowerShell, and it's a really cool way to interact with AWS. But like I mentioned at the beginning, that AWS security maturity model focuses heavily on AWS native services, and there is another service in on AWS that you can use to help with inventory management. It's called AWS Config. And AWS Config will go out and record every single item out there. They call them a configuration items or a CI. And that's going to get your roles, your IAMs, all the same things that Clay was able to pull out of that tag editor. They'll go out and pull and gives you a really accurate look at the resources. One of the key things you should note here, though, if you look in the top right of Clay's screen there, it says North Virginia. That means that AWS Config is a region-specific service. So again, that developer credit card problem, if you got a dev that spinning up some stuff over in EUS1, you're going to have to do some things with AWS Config. Now you can do multi-region runs and kind of do some things on the back end. But by default, it's region specific. So you kind of got to keep that in mind as everybody's like, oh, we only do stuff in US East 1. You might have some flyers out there that you might want to go take a look at. But config is really cool because one of the things along with just getting the inventory is you have the ability to set some compliance rules with config that can go out on behalf of you as the auditor and check to make sure things are working appropriately. And there's some cool auto remediation stuff that we'll talk about a little bit later. But Clay, I think we have a config rule here that we can show really quick just to give it a look before we head into IAM.
Yeah, I've got a couple set up here. So let's go ahead and let's look at the rules that we've got set up here. I chose just a few of the really simple ones here. These are not so much to identify our inventory as to begin finding problems maybe with the way that we've got that inventory configured. So the very first one that I've got set up here is looking at network access control lists to make sure that we don't have unrestricted access to admin ports like SSH or RDP. And you can see we've got a bit of a problem here. We've got 3 non-compliant resources. Now, if I were to click on that rule, then I can see the resources that have caused the particular problem with us. So in this case, I've got network ACLs going to EC2 instances that are overly permissive. Now, we've got a couple of other problems that we saw in config here as well. And if you look at these two, they're really both related to IAM, or identity and access management. So you can see that we've got to check to make sure that access keys have been rotated for our users. And I'm going to tell you the truth. We don't have a finding on that one because I haven't had this rule running long enough yet for me to have a finding on that one. We actually would, in this environment, have a problem because I've got some users with super old API keys in here. And then we've also got to check to see if we've got MFA enabled for the root account. So AJ, I guess that means we probably need to talk to them a little bit about IAM at some point. So why don't you start talking to us about that? What do I need to look at when it comes to identity and access management on AWS?
Yeah, and if you remember when we looked at the CAF categories, identity and access management was one of those areas. That's one of the key areas AWS says a security principle that you should be focused on there on the first row on the top right there. You got to manage identities and permissions at scale. And an interesting thing to remember with IAM is that on AWS, every single thing requires some level of IAM permissions or policies associated with it. By default, if I go create an account for Clay in an AWS account I'm running, he doesn't have permissions to do anything. I have to go enable permissions, similar with an EC2 instance or an S3 bucket. Every resource, you need to make sure you're giving permissions, which means it's pretty important to get those right. It doesn't matter all of the cool security things. I always talk to the customers we work with. Like, you can have all the bells and whistles, all of the security tools in place, but if you don't get IAM right, it's equivalent to having the great security system and you just have your door wide open. If they can walk right through the door without anything triggering off because you haven't managed identities, it doesn't really matter what else you do. So it's super important. And one of the first things, most important things you should look at as we think about the quick wins in the security maturity model, that root account. Your root account is that first ever account that's created when you create an AWS account. It can do everything, including close and shut down your account. So best practice is to not use that account. As soon as you create an account, go ahead and create an IAM user and an admin role. And Clay's going to do some demos here to take a look at some things. And then the other thing you want to do is enable multi-factor authentication. Super important that you have multi-factor authentication set up on that account. And you saw that Clay had that AWS config rule to check for a root MFA. And config is a tool that if you turn it on and you leave it on for longer than 30 days, you may incur a cost there. So if you're like, hey, I don't necessarily want to spend money to do some quick wins, there is another service called Trusted Advisor that gives you these 6 security checks, 6 core security checks for free. And look at that. The first one is MFA on the root account. That's how important it is. You're going to get this check to scream at you across the entire AWS landscape if you don't have MFA enabled. So it's a really important one to check and to make sure there's no glaring errors on the account. The root account is one of those that you should be screaming about on day one if you go in and see that the root account doesn't have MFA enabled. We're going to talk a little bit about some other ways to get some information, things like the IAM credential report. Clay's going to show you some stuff in PowerShell as well. But like I mentioned, we did want to share some open source resources out there as well that can help you with identity and access management stuff from a low-hanging fruit perspective. And one of the things about IAM that we should always keep in mind is the principle of least privilege. We got to make sure that users and resources do not have more access than they need. And a really cool tool that we'll drop a link to in the chat is called IAM Deescalate, created by the Palo Alto research team. And it allows you to help mitigate that privilege escalation risk. And it's going to go out and see, do people have the ability to escalate beyond what they probably need to do? And if so, let's move those permissions back and let you know what's going on. And there's a few other services, Access Analyzer, that we'll talk about a little bit later as well, that you can do some things with IAM as well. But again, identity and access management, one of those key security principles, doesn't really matter, like Clay was saying earlier, if you're hosted on AWS or Azure. You got to get identities right. One other note before, Clay, I let you start doing some demos here, is AWS has pushed heavily for folks to have SSO, single sign-on to log on to the console versus having some local IAM users. The credential report and some of these other tools that you see, you're not going to capture those users if you're doing single sign-on, if you're using like an Okta or a Duo or something out there to authenticate users before getting into the cloud. So that's just the one caveat. If you go in your environment and you go run this credential report or you go check some of these things that we're checking and you don't see any findings, if you're using SSO, you're going to have to go into that provider to kind of look deeper at what's going on there and what roles are associated. But Clay, I'd love for you to just show some ways that we can quickly get information about IAM here to figure out, are we compliant or not?
Sure. And let me actually start with AJ knows that this is the great fun of working in the AWS and really in any cloud environment. So SSO is already renamed. So as of about 3 or 4 weeks ago, it turns out AWS SSO is now called IAM Identity Center. So if you're going out and doing any research on how Amazon single sign-on works, it's now called IAM Identity Center. For those of us that maintain classes for SANS, we just, cringe every time we open the console and we're afraid something's going to have a different name or it's going to be put somewhere different. So I did want to throw that information out there for you guys. So let's see here. We were talking about AWM. What are some things that IAM, what are some things that I would want to look for if I were doing the compliance checks in the organization? Well, if we are using the older IAM process, then I probably want to start by just looking at the password policy. So that's the thing that I would think about first. If we're requiring passwords for our users, what is that basic password policy? Now, I think we're all adults here, so I'm just going to say this to you. Passwords are the worst way for us to authenticate our users. We should really be moving towards some sort of multi-factor authentication for everybody. But as long as we're using passwords, we want to make sure we're doing a good job of it. And I see a couple of immediate problems in this organization. It doesn't look like we really have a maximum password age here. So it looks like passwords are going to live forever. 8 characters might be a little bit of a short password length right now. And it doesn't look like we've got password reuse prevention turned on. So no expirations, no minimum or no maximum password age, meaning they could keep the password forever. That really looks like a bit of a problem for me. The basic complexity rules here don't look that bad, but I would definitely be talking to the organization about how do we move away from passwords, and then how do we do a better job with the passwords that we are using. Now, yep, good. Thank you for noting that SSO is now IAM Identity Center. Yeah, you're gonna have to watch that as you're dealing with AWS. So the next thing that I would do is take a look at the IAM account summary. And this one, again, I find to just be a little bit easier to do out here at the command line. Now, I'm using PowerShell, but we could do the same thing with the AWS CLI if we wanted to. There are a couple of things that I care about here. This is giving me information about the root account. So is MFA enabled for the root account in this environment? It looks like no, it's not. And we've already seen that in the console. So we're just validating what we already knew there. We're also seeing that we've got no MFA devices associated with the root user. So that's another clue for us as well. We can also get a feel for, is the organization really using roles? How many roles do we have created here? How many total users exist in the organization? There are several other interesting things in here, but I am definitely interested in that root MFA setting here, since this seems to be kind of a big configuration issue for us. In fact, with my clients, what I usually recommend is a hardware MFA device locked off in a safe somewhere. If your engineers actually all work in the same building, and I know that doesn't happen as much as it used to, if we could do that with a hardware device and go lock it up somewhere, that's perfect for me for that root user. Now, AJ is going to mention this to you. The root user is required sometimes for us to do certain things. We're going to talk about some S3 settings in a little while that you've got to be root to be able to do that. So we're not saying lock that root user up to the point that you can never get to the account, but it should be really rare that you use it. And we should really be paying attention to uses of that root account. Now, the other thing that we can do just as easily through the console, but since I'm at the command line, I'll just show you here, is request a credential report from AWS. So that credential report, I pre-requested this so that it would be a little bit faster here. You can go to the console and download this as a CSV. So if I were to go to credential report here in the IAM console, I can download this as a CSV. And what I'm going to end up with is a report that looks like this. Now I'm looking for things like the root account here to make sure that MFA is turned on. In fact, I can see here MFA is not enabled for any of my users. I'm looking at creation times and rotation times on access keys to make sure that they're appropriate. And one of the things that I will look for is whether we have multiple access keys for the same user. So you can see I've actually got a couple of users here. Let me get far enough over to show you that have more than one access key. That is really unusual, and it's something that I would definitely be asking questions about in the environment. You know, those API keys or access keys are effectively credentials to AWS. If they get exposed, then I've exposed whatever privilege that user has. If the user has two sets of keys, now I've got two sets of credentials that I've got to protect. So we really want to try to minimize that wherever we can. So take the time to use that credential report to see if you're doing a good job with IAM. All right, AJ, I'm taking a lot more time than I want to on the demo. So let me just kind of jump back and let you start talking to us a little bit about storage. I want to make sure that we get that out there before we run out of time today.
Absolutely, yeah, because if anyone here goes out to Google and does a quick Google search of S3 bucket breaches, you might not come back out of Google till tomorrow, because that's how deep of a rabbit hole you'll go down to see companies of all sizes who have had data breaches because their S3 buckets were not protected. And some of the basics here that you want to make sure is that your buckets shouldn't be public. They shouldn't be publicly accessible to anyone on the internet or anyone with an AWS account. You should have versioning enabled. You should make sure they're encrypted at rest. And actually, we're going to drop a link here in the chat around how to automate encryption at rest using AWS Config on the SANS Cloud Security channel that we'll share with you all. And then a next level setting that Clay was talking about earlier is ensuring that MFA delete is enabled on the buckets. And that's one of those that requires the root account. You have to use the root account to enable that. You do it through the CLI, and it's pretty quick. But that's one of those ones that you do need the root account. And we've showed you before here that on Trusted Advisor, you can see that S3 public bucket check for free. You can also see if there's any issues with bucket permissions using IAM Access Analyzer, as Clay's showing you here on the screen as well, to see, hey, this bucket ACL is actually a little bit permissive, and we have some things here that we should be concerned about. And data protection, another one of those areas that the CAF is calling out that we need to look at. So Clay, if you want to quickly here talk through the Access Analyzer and show them how to check some of these S3 bucket settings.
Sure. So I'm just going to show you briefly in the console here. Access Analyzer is going to look at really principle of least privilege for your organization. And so it can see here that I've got a bucket that it thinks has to open an ACL. In fact, it says, hey, this one allows public access. So it says, did you intend that? Do you want to just archive this finding because this really should be public access? Or did you not intend it and you want to go fix it? So here's where your engineers would be able to remediate this. But since we're really interested in automation, I want to show you just kind of quickly how I would take a couple of the measurements around this here. So let's start with an inventory. What buckets do we have? And you can see I've got 4 buckets set up in this environment. And then I'm going to use that same for each trick that I used before in PowerShell. And this is where I really like PowerShell for this, because I can say, hey, for this bucket, show me the encryption settings. And so as we go through every bucket, you can see, well, the first 3 don't have any encryption settings at all. The second one does actually allow for server-side encryption, and it uses the key management system rather than just a local bucket key. Now, we can also check for versioning and for MFA delete. In fact, that's really the same check. So I'm going to say, show me S3 bucket versioning for every bucket. And I can see for all of these, we've got MFA delete turned off and we've got versioning turned off. So AJ, why don't you just kind of quickly tell us what is MFA delete? And is this one of those things I need to be root for?
MFA delete is one of those things you need to be root for to enable. I mean, you also have to can only do it through the CLI, and it just requires that if you are going to delete anything from your buckets, if people are going to get rid of data, they're going to have to do it via multi-factor authentication, which adds that additional level so that there's no accidental deletion, especially if you're in one of those highly regulated environments where you have to retain data for a certain amount of time. This is probably a really good setting from a compliance perspective for you.
Cool. And we knew we would be close on time when it came to talk to you about infrastructure. So AJ gave me a really nice link to share with everyone of some better ways for us to do infrastructure access. One of the things that we run into is organizations trying to use Bastion hosts for secure shell or RDP. That's probably not the smart way for us to be doing admin access into our infrastructure today. So we wanted to leave you with some resources for that. We're going to share one last link in the chat, and that's going to be for some better ways for us to do infrastructure access in our organizations. And I think that brings us to the end of what we've got time for today. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to remind you that this is just the first of 3 live streams that we're going to do. So please come back on September 20th when we go through the same thing with Simon Vernon talking about Microsoft Azure. And then a couple of weeks after that when we bring Kat Traxel in to talk about Google Cloud. AJ, thank you so much. It is always awesome to get to see you and talk to you.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Clay. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.